Here we are at the first logical reasoning section, section 2 of LSAT PrepTest 157 over at lawhub.lsac.org. If you haven't already got one selected, go ahead and select a highlight color at this time. And we're going to read question 8's question stem to identify what the specific task is for this problem and marking it for clear reference as we go through the answer choices and the paragraph. 8 reads, the pattern of reasoning in which one of the following arguments most closely resembles the pattern of reasoning in the buyer's argument. So we could just highlight most closely resembles the pattern of reasoning in the buyer's argument, understanding we are looking at a parallel structure question task. We're going to read the buyer statements now and then just highlight what the conclusion is. The buyer statements read, as a buyer for a large chain of department stores, I will buy a garment only if it is fashionable and not too expensive for our clientele. The evening dress from the fall collection by Peruka is certainly fashionable, but it is far too expensive for our clientele. Therefore, I will not buy that dress. The conclusion should be pretty apparent. It's that statement after, therefore, the buyer will not buy that dress. And you should be able to recognize the presence of some conditional statements primarily from this phrase only if. And that is what we might want to highlight in a different color for clear reference. There are 2 conditions that must be met for the buyer to buy a garment. It must be fashionable and it must be not too expensive. And this dress from the Peruka fall collection, it satisfies one of those conditions. It is certainly fashionable, but it doesn't satisfy the second. It is far too expensive, which means logically the buyer will not buy the dress. So this is a valid argument. And what we're looking for from the correct answer is an argument that similarly presents 2 necessary conditions, one of which is met, the other which is not met, which then validly leads to the conclusion that the circumstance is not going to come to pass. So we will have a highlight tool ready to go as we look at the answer choices starting with A. And as soon as we find something that doesn't match this structure, we should eliminate relatively aggressively. So choice A reads, a snowflake will melt if it is in a warm place and not protected by insulation. This introduces what is known as a sufficient condition. It is something that will guarantee the outcome. It is not something that is necessary for the outcome. So choice A introduces sufficient conditional logic, not necessary conditional logic, and we should be able to eliminate it without even reading further. Then choice B, a stuffed animal in order to pass inspection must be free of sharp edges and completely sealed. Well, let's switch to the orange because must indicates necessary, and we've got 2 statements that must be met. It must be free of sharp edges and completely sealed in order to pass inspection. So we've got this structure that matches the buyer statements. This stuffed hippo is free of sharp edges. So one of those 2 conditions is met, but it is not completely sealed. So the second of the 2 conditions is not met, and that does logically lead to the conclusion that the hippo will not pass inspection in the exact same fashion as the buyer statements did. So if you recognize that all of these pieces match in choice B, you might move a little bit more briskly than we will here, especially if you're aiming for a 165 plus or a 170 plus on the LSAT. But for the purposes of this video, we will scroll on down and take a look at the remaining answer choices and find explicit reasons to eliminate them. Starting with choice C, a sidewalk is accessible if its edges are fully graded and if it has no sizable bumps. So once again, we've got conditional statements of sufficiency, not necessity. So those ifs can allow us to eliminate C almost immediately. Choice D says a poetic translation is accurate only if, okay, we do want a necessary statement. It adequately expresses the meaning of the original poem and gives an idea of the meter. So we'll go back to the orange and we've got our 2 necessary conditions. Then, this translation adequately expresses the meaning of the original and gives an idea of the meter. Well, we've met both conditions. We don't want to meet both conditions. We need one of them to not be met, so we can eliminate D as not matching the reasoning from the buyer in that fashion. And lastly, choice E, an assembly may call a meeting of the executive board only if the assembly meets quorum requirements and the motion passes by 2/3. Okay, so that only if has 2 conditions to meet. So E works so far. But this assembly meets quorum requirements So unless we've introduced an entirely new conditional statement with unless, I probably wouldn't even proceed at this point, knowing it does not match the structure from the buyer's argument. And of course, on the actual LSAT, you may have selected B already as the correct match to the pattern of reasoning in the buyer's argument.